Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Well, Mike, it's Tuesday, May 20th, 2025. And we're going to have a fun podcast today, one that is near and dear to you and something we have discussed for all the time we've known each other, and that is
40 years.
And that is the question of rights.
Well, this is going to be a roller coaster of a discussion because there's so much to say. It's confusing, it's rambunctious, and I'm looking forward to this. We're going to try to put some order on it so that it's coherent, right? Yeah. So why don't I start with sort of laying out what we are thinking of doing. You have an excerpt from one of our Giants of Political Thought series that kind of sets this up. You want to take that?
Yes. I'm going to play the first minute of the program of our presentation on the social contract by Rousseau. This is the first minute.
The place was Paris. The date was the 20th of Prairial of the year 2 in the French Revolutionary calendar, or more conventionally, the 8th of June, 1794. Maximilien Robespierre, the current leader of the revolutionary government, master of the Reign of Terror, was inaugurating the new religion he had decreed, the cult of the Supreme Being. The lavish ceremony was conducted in the Tuileries garden on a day of remarkable loveliness. Robespierre delivered one of his lengthy orations in front of most of Paris. Then, solemnly, he set fire to the statues representing atheism, folly, and vice. The figure of wisdom emerged triumphant from the flames. Next, a long procession followed Robespierre to the Champ de Mars, where the Eiffel Tower stands today. There, the immense crowd swore allegiance to the Republic. It was Robespierre's proudest moment. Less than 2 months later, he would fall from power and be himself guillotined.
So that shows you that rights, when the mob is determining what rights are, the mob can be, shall we say, fickle.
Yes, they can be a little elusive.
Yes, and by the way, just to kind of finish this, that was the French Revolution started with the fall of the Bastille in 1789. This was 1794. It went on for 10 more years. The French Revolution, thousands and thousands of Frenchmen killed each other, guillotining each other, and their economy, which was not strong to begin with, shrunk 60%. And the French Revolution fundamentally was fought over this question of who has rights, and if the rights are abused, how is that remedied? And
one way of looking at this is it's a tension between force and principle.
Yes.
So you're talking about the principle side. The force is one.
Yes.
We see in a lot of countries where the military does a coup and they overthrow the government. Whatever rights there are may disappear. So one question to ask is, do we live in a world that's red in tooth and claw, as one poet said, where it's just savage and we fight to win? In a civilized world, we have principles, we have the rule of law, and rights are an important part of that. I happen to think we're very confused about what rights are and how they work, and that's what we're hoping to shed some light on today.
That's great. Please.
Let's start in the ancient world. What I've read is that there was no concept of rights in ancient Rome or Greece or Jerusalem. A lot of times we think of Western civilization as being the combination of influences from the Greco-Roman tradition and the Christian tradition or Judeo-Christian tradition. Neither one of them had a concept of rights, but they did have a concept of right or righteousness. What is right? And so the Bible is filled with references to this kind of virtue. What is right living, and how do we live correctly? Now, in terms of power, they understood there would be civic power and religious power, and people were devoted to both in various ways. I think Jesus said, give to Caesar what's Caesar and God what's God's. But there was a clear idea that people were subject to these powers and obedient to one or the other in some conflict in a lot of situations. So there's a clear idea of right, but what we understand of rights is something different. The best definition that I've seen is in another production we did in Knowledge Products on human rights and civil rights. And that author said it is a moral idea, it's a kind of a claim or title to something that cannot be justly denied. So here we tied to the concept of justice, right? If your rights are abused, you're being treated unjustly.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a wide range of what we consider to be unjust. One that comes to mind for me is equality. Some people think of it as equality of condition. If I don't have the same as you, then it's not justice. Therefore, my rights have been abused. Another way of thinking about it is people get what they deserve, right? And if they get what they deserve, they get something different from somebody else because not everybody deserves the same thing. We're in far too different circumstances. So which one of those concepts of justice works? And then how does it apply to who has a right to what? Then you have the idea that some rights are inalienable, meaning they belong to you just by virtue of being born.
Mm-hmm.
They can't be taken away.
What is the source of inalienable rights?
A key point, yes. And so what the founders of the United States said was that it's from their creator, from our creator, not from government.
Correct.
Okay? So those kind of rights are given to us by our nature of being alive. And we might call them natural rights. That's another little spin of this. Not quite the same. Nature may have some, but they're very close. Nature may give us rights that are presumed to come from God. One thing I think I'd like to do is just talk about the sheer range of rights that we have, and let's go through them a little bit to show how much we're trying to draw together.
When you say the sheer range of rights that people claim,
yes.
are rights.
Yes. And we're going to get to which are rights and what kind of rights are they, what do they mean?
Or are they even rights at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I think my understanding is that rights really didn't come to be understood or talked about until the 16th and 17th centuries, the 15 and 1600s, when Western civilization was beginning to emerge from the power of the kings. So you had power now being given to legislatures, this transition to people being in charge rather than gods and kings.
Yeah, and the philosophers of that time, Montesquieu, Bacon, Voltaire, when they were trying to talk, they talked about the justice, they talked about the separation of powers. And a lot of what they thought got into the Declaration of Independence and mostly into the Constitution in terms of the separation of powers. But what was interesting was this. Their separation of powers was the following. It was the monarch, the parliament or the legislature, and an independent judiciary.
This is in France or Europe before the U.S. We didn't have a monarch in the U.S. So
but even in England. In other words, in Europe, the European philosophers, it was still the monarch would be the executive branch. So it wasn't an elected executive branch. It was an elected legislative branch, and then you had an independent judiciary. And the idea was that you'd have this separation of powers, and so you'd have balance. But we now know from history is that is how France was organized when they had the French Revolution. That's how England was organized when they had the Glorious Revolution 100 years before the French Revolution. So that is when you have a monarch that is inherited, a monarchy that's inherited, then the people didn't select that person, and that type of government is inherently unstable.
And so that's the way it was for most of human history.
Yes.
And so you see Western civilization emerging out of that. One of the themes I hear in what you're describing is an attempt to limit power, to balance and limit power. So one of the questions we will ask about rights later is what is the limiting principle on some of these rights? Because there doesn't appear to be much of a limit on a lot of rights claims that we hear.
Okay.
But let's run through the kinds of rights that we hear about. In the Declaration of Independence in the United States, you had life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness was a substitute for property in the original draft.
Right.
But you can't have taxes if people have an absolute right to property. And so they said, we'll back off of that one a little bit. In the Declaration of Independence, it says we're created equal. That can be construed as a type of right to be treated equally under the law. That's not necessarily the way we think of equality today. Some people think it means something other than just being equal at a court.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the Constitution, there were a number of rights laid out. And then there was the Bill of Rights that was adopted into the Constitution. And we're all familiar with those, freedom of speech, religion, freedom of assembly, the integrity of your home that can't be just barged into by the troops, There's some aspects of freedom of conscience, which they describe as freedom of religion. So those are all in our Constitution and Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Most of us are educated on that in our schools.
Yeah, and our Constitution, primarily in terms of rights, the Constitution itself, prior to the Bill of Rights, which was voted on right after the Constitution was voted on, was the Constitution separated power between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary or the Supreme Court. That's what it did. So it was establishing rights between those three branches of government.
And powers, yes.
And powers.
Right.
But the Constitution itself, before the Bill of Rights, did not list individual rights, and the adopters of the people who wrote the Constitution and ratified the Constitution said that needs to be included separately, or it needs to be included. And so they then actually I think there were like 20 amendments that were offered for the Bill of Rights, and 10 made the cut.
Survived.
10 made the
And
cut.
certain states would not approve the Constitution until those were included.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So, what we've described so far, what you might call natural rights or religious rights or rights given by God, inalienable rights, they don't have anything to do with being given by government. You have a whole class of rights that are statutory rights. There's civil rights, big category in the 1960s and 70s. You have now rights for the disabled. People claim gay rights, transgender rights, rights for the disabled. They're all sensitive to people that are marginalized, and there is an immoral imperative there. But are these natural rights? Are they religious rights? Are they civil rights or statutory rights, et cetera? You start to see a mix here that gets very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Rights for the mentally ill. We decades ago turned them out of institutions because they were thought to have rights not to be essentially imprisoned. But now in our more mature stage as a country, people claim rights to health care, housing, food, child care, education, and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
Here we're not seeing rights so much as powers. They are liberties. Well, I shouldn't say they're entitlements. These are entitlements. And so if you have a right to these things, it means if you can't or don't provide them for yourself, somebody else has to through the government.
If somebody's forced to by the government, or the government borrows money to fund them, and ultimately that has led to the unsustainable amount of spending.
Yes,
but the other one, Michael, that you didn't mention was you now have immigrant rights.
Yes.
And you have people who actually argue that if you come into our country illegally, you are entitled to all of the rights that a citizen is entitled to.
So,
there are people who claim that.
Yeah, so this reminds me that one of the aspects of rights is that they are non-negotiable. If you claim a right, it means I don't have to debate this with you. It's mine. It belongs to me. You don't have anything to say about it.
Mm-hmm.
And this becomes a political weapon to demand what I want. And if I claim that it's a right, you have to somehow show that it's not mine by right. So you have people claiming rights for all sorts of stuff. I must have rights in here somewhere. They're searching for a tool to fight a political contest.
Right. Right.
Right. So,
Correct.
And I do think a lot of times people claim a right when they mean it's right to have this condition.
Or
right?
I want.
I want.
I want something there, but I can't say I want it because then I won't get it. But if I claim I have a right to it,
Yes.
then I make the moral argument that you're a bad person if you don't give me what I have a right to have.
Yeah, you backfoot the other person.
Right.
So it's a political weapon.
Yeah.
So it's important now to distinguish between positive rights and negative rights. Negative rights are the kind we saw in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They're mostly leave me alone. And by the way, the Ten Commandments are mostly negative. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not. There's only a couple thou shalts.
Okay.
They're sort of freedoms, if you will. Okay, that's really not the right way to put it. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a difference between negative rights to leave me alone and positive rights to entitlements.
Well, and then when you say leave me alone, so for example, if you ask the average person, should every American have the right to work? Should every adult have the right to work? And almost everybody will say yes. And then you say, should every American have the right to the fruits of their work, to the earnings of their work?
Yes.
That's where you now get into dispute. Well, no, not everybody has the same right to the fruits of their work. Well, why not? And then that's when you get into these other rights that you're about to describe. Because our country went along for over 150 years where the rights of the individual to work and keep the fruits of their own labor, until we had the income tax, there was no right to take any part of anybody's income. There wasn't a right to do that. And that was in 1913.
13, I was going to say 109 years ago.
Yeah.
Is that right? 100.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
for almost 150 years.
Yeah, 108, I guess.
Yeah. And then, by the way,
12.
what was interesting is when you look at what the argument was at the time, they said that the only people who would be taxed would be the very wealthy, and the top marginal tax rate would be 7%. That is the most anyone would pay. Well, by the end of the First World War, which was only a few years later, you're up to 70 to 80%. It's just fascinating how fascinating it is when the government gets a legal right to do something. It's astounding. And just as the French Revolution, that when we were playing that, when government has the power, gets the power to do something, it's amazing how quickly it abuses its power. And that's really fundamentally what we're grappling with today, because there's a $2 trillion a year deficit that is known. And then there's another $1 trillion a year where the government has been borrowing money and then loaning it. For example, student loans are not an expense. So if student loans are made, but they're not repaid, the government still had to borrow the money to make the loans. And so our deficit was actually growing at a much faster rate than the stated deficit. And so that's what we're grappling with right now. In fact, when I say right now, the big, beautiful bill, so-called great, big, beautiful bill, and then the appropriations spending budget for next year, which begins October 1st, those are all going to be in front of us in the next 90 days.
Yeah, how we choose to budget for this.
And how we choose to, yeah. And so it's going to be, it's really, so the discussion you and I are having, while it seems to be theoretical, it is incredibly practical.
And let me try this claim on you and see how you think about it. I would say that if we don't get control of this unlimited notion of rights, particularly economic entitlements, we have no hope of settling our financial affairs. Mm-hmm. And we haven't mentioned pensions.
Right,
We
exactly.
mentioned healthcare and education. Now, we did not mention old age pensions. They were started for people that lived a couple years past retirement age. Now we're living 20, 30 years past retirement age. And there's a moral component. Are we obligated to pay salaries to people who have retired? But there's also a statutory one, because you and I have been paying into this system for decades. The money's already been spent. Mm-hmm. It's not there waiting for us to collect it as it would be if we had invested it. You have young people now paying off an obligation made to us with in return for money that's already been spent.
Right, and a promise to keep the log rolling as they get older. And
in the private sector, they call that a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
Where you pay off today's investors with the proceeds from yesterday's investors.
Yeah.
And it runs out eventually. It's like musical chairs. Somebody doesn't have a seat to sit in.
Or you pay off yesterday's investors.
Is that, I may have said it wrong.
You pay off yesterday's investors with money from today's investors.
Today's investors.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting, Mike, is the history of this. Because in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge gave a speech to the Prudential Insurance Company. And Prudential was the largest seller of annuities. And he pointed out in that speech that 70% of Americans invested in annuities. So an annuity was a form of savings for retirement. And it was owned by the individual who invested in the annuity. And so we were already seeing in the 1920s that people were planning for their own, quote, retirement. But back in those days, people only lived 2 or 3 years past the time when they stopped working, because life expectancy back then was like 62. And then Roosevelt comes along and passed the Social Security system. And it's important to understand that the promises that he made, first of all, he called it an insurance program. It wasn't, but he called it that. Mm-hmm. And the media sold it as an insurance program. He also said the most anybody would ever have to pay out of their pay is 3%, I think, on the first $2,000. So $60 a year was the most anybody would pay. Well, we now know that turned out to be completely false. But the other thing is that at the time there was a senator named Clark who offered an amendment to make the payments into the Social Security system to go into what you and I would think of today as a personal IRA.
Yes.
And that amendment got defeated. Had that amendment been passed, the Social Security system today would be more than fully funded. And that's what's so interesting about. And so here we live in the home of the free and the nation of brave, the home of the free, all of that. And
land of the free and home of the brave.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. And so that's where but yet we could have that over one vote. The whole entitlement system that you and I are talking about today would be fully funded versus being projected to go into bankruptcy in a few years.
It's not our topic today, but I'll just mention that there's a whole category of historical writing about what if. It's contingent history. Like apparently Alexander was almost killed in a battle. He was stunned with an axe, and the deathly blow was about to be laid on him, and somebody killed the attacker. So if Alexander had been killed at that point, what would have happened in human history? Or the missionary Paul, as he left, Turkey, what we know as Turkey, and went north into Europe. What if he had turned right instead of turned left? Would Europe have been Christian? Or so questions like that. Historians know Churchill was hit by a taxi in New York just before World War II and hospitalized, almost killed. If he had been killed, what would the war look like?
Wow.
I find that fascinating.
Yes.
Where history turns on such little things as you've pulled out
yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So as we think about rights, one theme I want to raise is the notion of individual rights versus group rights. Not to get too much into philosophy, but there were a group of folks in the 1800s, utilitarians, that thought everything ought to be pitched toward the greatest good for the greatest number. Mm-hmm. It's sort of a calculation of what's best off for everybody altogether. Rousseau had a similar idea of the general will. This was, this thing he couldn't really define and contradicted himself all over the place trying to say what the general will is. But it was a collective idea of what's best for everybody.
Yeah, Rousseau was kind of considered to be the father of the French Revolution. And Robespierre, who was the leader of the French Revolution, said so. Okay, that his ideas came from Rousseau, and Rousseau wrote the social contract. And in the
That's
social
the name of the book that he wrote.
Yes, and the social contract stipulated that the individuals would alienate all of their rights, and by everybody alienating all of their rights, everybody would be then equally free. Which almost sounds like a contradiction. An immediate contradiction. And by the way, Karl Marx believed the same thing. He says, from each his ability, to each their needs. That was his phrase for what social justice and a proper economic program, a proper economic system would be.
And we still have a lot of people who think of rights in this way, as a systemic, a collective sort of rights, particularly when you have group rights that attach to an ethnic group or a social class, or to a class of immigrants, for instance, where their rights might be described in collective terms. So we can contrast this with the Western idea that rights accrue to the individual by nature of their creation, right?
Well, some rights can.
Yes.
Other rights, so what you have to get into, Michael, I think we're kind of talking about here is. There should be, or there is by definition, there has to be a hierarchy of rights. So, for example, let's say we agree that everybody who has a home owns their home. Let's just say that that's a right. And then somebody else says, well, I think I have a right to come to your party. Well, no, you weren't invited. Well, you don't have the right to not invite me. I have a right to be there. There are people there I want to talk to. And so,
Yeah.
so do I have to do that? And then once I'm there, well, you know what? I'd like to spend the night tonight in your extra bedroom. You're not using it. I'd like to have the right to do that.
Well, this goes to the right of property, which is the power to exclude. And you remember these poems about good fences make good neighbors?
Oh, yeah,
Sure. And so this is the point of having properties. You do with it as you wish, and other people can't tell you what to do with it.
Well,
that's quite compromised now because regulation tells us what to do with our property.
Yeah, and so for people as they're thinking about what their rights are, freedom of speech was, until a few years ago, freedom of speech. Everybody agreed that people had freedom of speech unless the freedom of speech was designed to cause physical harm or immediate danger. But more recently, people argue, well, you don't have the right to say whatever you want to if it hurts my feelings.
Yeah, or if it harms somebody more generally.
No, hurts my feelings, not harm, because harm includes physical harm. I'm just saying if it bothers me, or if I believe it's misinformation or disinformation, and we got all of that with COVID.
Right.
We got all of that in elections, and so this is where and by the way, our society has been able to handle these arguments about rights because we've generally reverted to the way that rights are thought about from the beginning of our country. We fall back to that. So for example, under the Biden administration, they actually tried to set up a person who would define misinformation and disinformation, and that person was ridiculed, and that effort was stopped.
Yes.
So it didn't happen. But what would, as you say, what would happen if there were a committee that determined what can be said and what can't be said? Now we're having all these debates over whether or not Biden was cognitively impaired while he was president. But at the time, you couldn't discuss that. Now all these media books are coming out, and these were the very people who claimed you couldn't.
Books by media figures?
By media figures who claimed that Biden was in perfect mental health. And now the very same people who are claiming that he was in perfect mental health are now writing books about how unmentally fit he was and how they had been tricked.
Yeah, it was covered up by somebody else.
Yes, covered up by somebody else.
Well, freedom of speech can't be clearer in our Constitution. It's pretty simply stated.
Yeah.
But still, we have difficulties asserting that right to free speech, right?
Yeah, and freedom of association is another. It says that we have a right to peaceably assemble and offer redress.
Right.
It doesn't say mostly peaceful. It doesn't say that you can be violent. It doesn't even say that you can interrupt people who are giving a speech and call that a legal protest, because it doesn't even say that. The Constitution says you can peaceably assemble, and that's a good thing to be able to peaceably assemble. But the question is whether or not people who interrupt speakers who've been invited, and they interrupt them to the point where the speaker who's been invited can't speak.
Well, we had this in the last State of the Union speech.
Okay.
Where a representative stood up and started shouting at Trump.
But that person was removed.
He was removed under the rules of the House.
Right.
But the idea that you have a right to protest has limits. And so this is a really interesting point what are the limiting principles?
There you go.
In the law, generally they look for a limiting principle on any kind of judicial action. It just doesn't run infinitely everywhere forever. There's a limiting principle to it. And do we have those for these rights?
So for example, let's go back to the right to work. So the limiting principle is if I have the right to work, we have laws on child labor, for example. And we have those on child labor because we recognize or we believe that there's a mental or physical, as children are small, they're mentally not mature, they're physically not mature. So we have laws about that. We have laws on the books about overtime. So we have different ways of thinking about this. But the fruits of your labor is something that is widely disputed. I heard on a TV program where there are 5 people sitting around talking about the great big beautiful bill, and one person on the panel said that the 10 wealthiest people in the country have $1.8 trillion of net worth. and that our budget deficit is 1.8 trillion. And said, "Now I'm not." And then he said, "I'm not advocating that we take their money and pay for the deficit, but I'm just pointing out the disparity." And so, had I been on the panel, I would have said, "Well, why don't we take their 1.8 trillion and pay it?" But then the problem that you have, and I'd look at him and say, "Whose money are we going to take next year?" Because the 1.8 trillion was a 1-year deficit, and the 1.8 trillion that these 10 people had was accumulated over 30 years. And then once it's gone, the next 1.8 trillion wouldn't come from 10 people. And then where would the next 1.8? And so this is what happens is you eat your seed corn eventually if you don't reduce your spending. So the rights, this gets into your question of rights is, do I have the right to free health care? Do I have the right to a free education? Do I have a right to free food? Do I have a right to free housing? And can I be made, if I believe I have those rights, can I be made by statute to work if I'm able to work? Which is what the current debate is over Medicaid. Is do able-bodied people who choose not to work, should they be eligible for Medicaid? And there's a huge debate over that question.
Right.
Yeah. So it's we live in interesting times. And
let's go back to a point that you raised earlier and we didn't pursue, and that is a hierarchy of rights.
Thank you. Okay.
So why don't you say more about what you had in mind?
Well, you have like if everybody has a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, what does that mean? And the rights to the right to work, the right to the fruits of your labor. If I have a right to work and I have the rights to the fruits of my labor, I'm going to use Tennessee as an example compared to the federal government. And I want to divert here just for a second. When our Constitution was passed, this was after the Articles of Confederation had failed. And so
this is at the national level.
At the national level.
Articles of Confederation. We had no such document in Tennessee. So you're talking about the Tennessee Constitution about the time the U.S. Articles of Confederation were failing.
Yes. And the Articles of Confederation was the document under which the 13 colonies operated.
Yes.
And it operated under the Articles of Confederation for only 5 years after they were ratified by all 13 colonies. And they failed.
Yes.
And the people who convened to amend the Articles of Confederation all agreed that serious amendments were necessary. They didn't agree on what the amendments would be, but they agreed that what existed was not sustainable and must be changed.
Well, what they end up agreeing is had to be replaced.
Yes, that's what they started with one and said let's replace it. But what was interesting was they took what they knew to have been wrong with the Articles of Confederation, which was that each colony could coin money. Mm-hmm. And what they said was, we're going to separate these powers, and we're going to let the federal government have and only the federal government can coin money. But we're also going to say that the federal government's powers are very limited. So they enumerated the powers of the federal government in Section 8, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
And just to clarify, enumeration means they specifically listed them and said, any power not listed here, you don't have it.
You don't have it, and the states do.
Yeah.
And so we lived under that document for about 150 years. The income tax passed in 1913, but Calvin Coolidge gave a speech in 1923 in which he said that the total federal spending was $3 billion, and over $2 billion of it was on defense. So total federal non-defense spending was less than 1/7,000th of what it is today, just to give a sense of proportion. And that went on for a long, long time. Now, there were other issues that certainly were slavery was a terrible, we now know that slavery could have been fatal to our country because we had a war over it. And more people died in that war than any other war that America has been involved in.
A central aspect of that dispute was the right to the fruits of your labor.
Yes, exactly.
Which is a violation of your inalienable natural right to have the benefit of your labor
and other freedoms.
Yes.
I mean, it was clear that people who were black, people who came from Africa, who had been brought from Africa, were going to be treated as a completely separate class of not even citizens.
Yeah.
They were going to be completed as a separate class of individuals and with no individual rights. And so that was unsustainable. That itself was unsustainable.
Yeah.
But it still took a long time to remedy it. And then we're still dealing with the aftermath of the remedy, and that goes back and forth as to what is the best way to remedy that. But what I was trying to get around to there was the Constitution gave the federal government only the right to coin money, and then it tried to limit those powers so that the states who couldn't coin money would be the ones who had the responsibility to care for the people within their borders, however each individual state saw fit.
And so that would include all these categories of rights we've mentioned that include health care, housing, food, child care, education, roads. And because all of that was purely state matter.
Was left to the states, and the states because they couldn't print money, they were limited by, they were constrained is the right word. Mm-hmm. They were constrained by what they could do because they couldn't create the resources out of thin air to do more than they were willing to tax their own people. And they had the right under the Constitution to tax their own people however they wanted to. But they were constrained because the voters are close, and if you overtax somebody too much, they could move to another state. Right. And so there were natural constraints in place. But then over time, much of the power in the states to spend money on these various rights went to the federal government, where there was no constraint on the coining of money. And now you have $37 trillion of debt and an increase in deficit spending that everybody agrees is unsustainable. And it is, as you say, Mike, it is really all over people who are claiming that I have the right to this and the right to that. We even have arguments that people who are federal employees believe they have a right to their job. They have a right to keep their job, even if their agency is bloated. Even if say the agency's grown 50% in number of employees in the last 3 years, they say, well, I still and they're on probation. They're probationary employees. They say I still have a right to keep my job.
What kind of right is that? It's not a statutory right.
No. Well,
is it?
It's not a statutory right, but they go to court, and if the courts rule that they have a right to keep their job, then guess what?
Well, my point is, where do you even have the idea that it's a right? It's not a natural right that I can force you to employ me.
Right. Correct. It's the federal government, and I'm not saying that this is a solution. I'm saying that if the federal government were forced to balance its budget, there would be something constraining the politicians. They would have to act. They'd have to agree. They can agree to disagree, but ultimately they have to agree to either raise taxes or they have to agree to a spending limit. But now they don't have a constraint on either one of those things. Mm-hmm. And but yet all of them agree, well, the deficit spending cannot continue. And so all of these issues, as you point out, all these issues are really, they boil down to what different groups claim is their right. You have Bernie Sanders, who believes that everybody has a right to health care. And he used to talk about millionaires and billionaires, taxing them, but he's a millionaire now, so he only talks about billionaires.
Well, the question that immediately occurs to me is, what's the limiting principle on that? Can you spend millions of dollars per person with new joints, new hearts, new everything, a bionic person at public expense?
Well, and then also, is there a way? Because there's nothing constraining, and I'm not really talking about the limiting factor. I'm talking about the constraint.
Well, what's the difference between a limit and a constraint?
Well,
to me, they're the same thing.
Well, no. Well, I'm going to give you what I think of as the difference here. The limiting factor you're talking about is does it make sense to spend millions of dollars in healthcare on a particular individual? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And if there is no constraint, then the argument will almost always be, yes, it's compassionate to do that, we should do it. But if they had to tax people in order to do it, and in the numbers that we're talking about, to tax people to do it, then the voters would say, wait a minute, let's think about this. Or is there a better way? So we've argued in previous podcasts that our healthcare, the way we run our healthcare system, I believe there's $2 trillion of waste in the way we have organized and run our healthcare system in just the payment system part. Has nothing to do with the providing of the care. It's the system itself. And because there's no constraining factor, all of the special interests that benefit from the way the system is currently organized win, because they've got 12,000 lobbyists defending the way that the current system is.
Yeah.
And because the politicians don't have to raise taxes to maintain the current system, the voters can only vote generally for reform and then hope
that somebody carries it
that
out.
Somebody carries it out.
Let me bring us back to this notion of a hierarchy of rights.
Please.
Because, we started with divine rights, the division between the civic authority and the divine authority. You had the divine right of kings for millennia. Mm-hmm. And so in the mid...
And let's tell what divine right of kings, how that actually, from a practical standpoint, what that meant.
Well, you had kings that were claiming that they were essentially commissioned by God or authorized by God to be his authority on earth.
Right. And therefore, anything the king decreed was divinely inspired and therefore just, regardless of what it was.
That's right. What he said was just by definition.
Yeah.
Which raises an interesting philosophical point, is justice independent from God's judgment? Okay, this is I find fascinating. Child suffering is bad in my opinion. It's bad by its nature. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what God thinks about it or chooses. No reasonable God would ever make a choice that that's good or bad. It's not God's discretion. It's in its nature bad. And so I think that's part of what we're getting to by these inalienable rights, these God-given rights, that they are not up to somebody to choose to give or take away. And so you had in the middle 1500s, 1600, you had people starting to take away these powers of kings and deny the divine right of kings. Mm-hmm. But you still have this conflict between where does authority come from? And two things come to mind. When John F. Kennedy was elected, he was this president of the U.S. He was the first Catholic president. And there was all kinds of controversy about, is he have allegiance to the country or to the Pope?
Yeah, I remember that.
So there's a corollary between the civic power and the divine power, right? And people fought over that. His opponents basically accused him of being subversive and loyal to a foreign power.
Right.
It was BS, but that's
what
and
I don't believe they believe that, but they were using it as a political tool.
Cudgel.
Yeah.
Then when Clarence Thomas was being affirmed to the Supreme Court, he was asked about his idea of natural rights, because natural rights supersede civic rights. Mm-hmm. And so is he going to be loyal to what he thinks religious rights are, natural rights, and overrule civic rights because he thinks there's a higher power? It's the very same kind of conflict.
Right. And the way he answered that, by the way, is that to the extent that the Constitution lays out natural rights, and then that would be, in other words, he put the Constitution. He said the role of a Supreme Court justice is to read the Constitution and apply the law as the Constitution is written, and not to make it up based on what I think would be better than the Constitution. It's not my job to improve the Constitution. We have an amendment process to improve the Constitution.
There's a famous line from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice, who said, "Sir, this is a court of law, not a court of justice." Yeah. And he's making a similar point. I've got to apply the law as it's written.
Right.
And so back to our hierarchy, ideally you'd have these justice and these ideal rights, these abstract rights, these natural rights encoded into civil law and what we understand justice to be, right? But it's always done imperfectly, and there's no end to the controversies about what's just. Yeah. And so we continue to fight about it.
Yeah, but you asked me earlier about the hierarchy of rights, and I've as you were saying that, I said, I think I've got a way of expressing it, and that is, if I have the right to the fruits of my labor, if the rights to the fruits of my labor are more my rights than the rights of you to take away the fruits of my labor for your benefit, the question is, whose rights are superior?
Yes.
Because they both cannot coexist.
Yes.
They're in conflict. And so when rights are in conflict, society has to decide which is the superior right. And whatever that superior right is, it is. It is a higher order right than the other right. So, for example, if I have the right to who comes into my home, if I have that right, then your right to come to my party, as funny as you are, your right to come to my party depends on my willingness and desire to invite you to my party. Or your right to stay in my extra bedroom depends on me. Now, if on the other hand, if government says no, extra bedrooms should be able to be used by society, then all of a sudden the right to my home and how it's used is now no longer the higher order right. It becomes a lower order right. And so, and that is that sounds like an extreme example, but quite frankly, and I feel very strongly about this, women's sports are being attacked now by people who believe that biological males under certain conditions are allowed to compete against women. And we see the results are that the biological males regularly win. And so the question is, what happened to the rights of females to be able to compete with other females? Is it superior to that of a person who was born a biological male and claims now to be a female, and therefore be able to compete and win? And I don't know. That is a political question right now, and each party has really at this point picked a side. I don't know a Democrat in Washington who sides with women. I don't know a single one, and I don't quite understand that. Even from a political standpoint, I don't understand that. But from a biological standpoint, I mean, women fought for decades to be able to be treated equally in sports with men and have funding and have their own competitions, and now that's being destroyed. So that is the question: where is the higher order right? That's an example of you can't have both rights cannot exist.
Coexist. One has to be superior to the other.
Yeah.
In a legal context, what you're saying is we have to choose.
Yeah.
And so this is a hierarchy.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about a year ago called Deep Trade-Offs, and it's more generally about this idea that as individuals, we have to choose between competing values that cannot both be fully realized. And so it articulates a number of ways in which we don't think about these choices being competing in that way, but they are.
Yes.
And the law has to sort them out when it's presented with specific cases. What I was looking at is in our personal lives.
Yeah.
All values have a rival. Even kindness.
Yeah.
You think kindness is...
Now say that again.
All values have a rival value.
That's interesting.
That challenges it.
Yeah.
So I've gone through a list of 300 values, meaning something you find to be important.
Yeah.
And every one has a competitor. Okay? Name one that you think doesn't have a competitor.
And that's in your book called?
Deep Trade-Offs.
Oh, Deep Trade-Offs. Okay.
Yeah, and I deal with 3 of them, and there's more still to come, hopefully. But, for instance, kindness. Who would disagree with kindness? Well, when your hair's on fire, people are not very kind. When you're in a war, kindness may not prevail.
Okay.
There are other values that are more like survival, often trumps other ones.
Sure.
Other values. And so
Right.
This is the point. We don't realize that, in euthanasia and abortion, it's the same thing. You have the right to autonomy, to make your own decisions, the duty not to harm, the respect for law, the obligation to respect the law. Those 3 plus more are all entwined in those disputes, and you can't have all 3 of those. You've got to choose. You've got to make a hierarchy.
Well, and that's where our legal system, by statute, that's where our Constitution says these should be left up to the states, because we have lots of different opinions, and rather than have a one size fits all, we need to let the states decide these things. And I think that is a far more flexible system that can deal with change than if everything were a one-size-fits-all.
I think that's well put. And let me take it one other step as a way of kind of winding up here. Individual rights might be understood as a way of pointing to self-government. You have the right to make your own choices.
Okay.
And in a free society, we have maximal individual rights instead of so much regulation, so much taking of your money for somebody else to decide what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I understand individual rights. And if we think of rights rather than group rights as individual rights, I think it points the way toward a freer and more just society.
Mm-hmm. And more opportunity. So Michael, kind of to wrap this up and go back to the very beginning, the giants of political thought, we cover the Common Sense was Thomas Paine. That was his pamphlet that kind of sparked the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence lays out exactly what we're talking about is right. It's all the Declaration of Independence. If you read it very carefully, it's all about rights. It truly is all about rights. And then prior to that, you had these thinkers. You had Rousseau, you had Marx, you had John Locke, you had Thomas Hobbes. You have all of these different thinkers. And each one of those thinkers thought that what they thought was good and just and best. They all thought that. It didn't mean it was, but they all thought that. And their ideas have had a profound influence on the world today. And so I would encourage those who find our conversations interesting to go to the giantsofpoliticalthought.com, giantsofpoliticalthought.com, look at the different topics and the different great thinkers that we cover, and then if they find that to be interesting, to subscribe. And one thing they should know, because I just use this myself, we have the audio, which I listened to The Social Contract on my way to Chattanooga, which was a great way to spend that hour and a half.
And that's why we heard that excerpt at the beginning.
That's why we heard that at the
You've
beginning.
just been refreshed on it.
Yeah. But we also have the transcripts so people can read it and study it. And I found that to be very useful.
Look up things like where did he say something about horses?
Right. And then we have questions. And so that after you have finished listening, if you finish reading and studying it, you can turn to the questions, and you can and they're questions of fact, they're questions of meaning, and then they're questions that are kind of classical questions that don't have a particular answer, but are great for discussions. And so homeschoolers would find, I think, what we do interesting, plus people who went to college and didn't get a chance to study these particular thinkers and these times in history. I think they'd find it interesting.
Well, I know I didn't. I went to engineering school, have an engineering degree, and I didn't get to study these things at a college level. So it was vital for me.
Yeah, good. Well, Michael, the subject of rights will not disappear. They'll be in future podcasts because that's what the political, and it's always been that.
It's threaded
as
throughout.
long as there's been politics
in the West.
Yeah.
Some other countries don't see it that way.
Don't
they
see it the
argue
same
that,
way.
But some of their people want it to be that way. They admire the West and want to have a model more like that. I know some Chinese like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Michael,
Okay.
that's
Till next
the end
time.
of it today.
Okay.
Thank you.